Most startups fail, and the most common reason that they fail is lack of customers. It often takes years for founders to realize that their startup project won't meaningfully get customers. I've experienced this personally on many of my startups. I've met other founders who've also wasted years. I don't accept that founders waste so much time pursuing bad ideas. I think about the opportunity cost, all of the compelling problems that founders could have been solving, all of the ways that they could have been making the world meaningfully better if only they'd been able to distinguish distractions from promising projects. I believe it is possible to distinguish distractions from promising projects. I think we can divide between bad ideas and ideas with the possibility of success. Of course, this requires a rethinking of conventional entrepreneurship. Welcome to the Nascent Podcast. I'm Mike Vladimir. A good idea is the foundation of a successful startup, but good ideas are hard to recognize, so entrepreneurs often waste years before giving up on an idea. Too often, founders feel horrible because their startup failed. Well, I'm here with a little bit of good news. It is not your fault. You have been using flawed tools. And here's some even better news. There's now a new way to avoid wasting years on a bad startup idea. I call it nascent methodology. Let's get into it. It used to be that founders would build products solely based on their assumptions and their intuition without ever talking to the people that they hoped would become their customers. And then about 20 years ago, Steve Blank wrote the book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which Eric Ries followed up with The Lean Startup. Those books offered meaningful improvements. Steve's solution to get out of the building and Eric's tools for build, measure, learn, and minimum viable product and fail fast, all of that clearly moves entrepreneurship forward. And these books and the ideas in these books have become some of the foundations of conventional startup strategy. Even though there's been all this progress, there's still more to do. What bothers me the most? It's that founders still spend years on projects that are dead ends. And this is why I'm excited to relaunch Nascent as a podcast and a project and now a business. The word nascent means just coming into existence and beginning to display signs of future potential. It's now March 2026. I've been in entrepreneurship for 20 years, and I've been specifically doing work related to Nascent for 12 years. About a dozen years ago, I started mentoring founders when I first got out of business school. Founders kept telling me that they really liked my perspective, that they found it really unique and helpful. So after hearing that for a few years, I started to write down raw notes that I was thinking of compiling into a book. At this point, those notes are about 200 pages. And that book evolved into a newsletter and a podcast. And then about a year ago, that evolved into workshops, where I actually work directly with founders to share these ideas and to implement nascent methodology on their startups. Nascent was born from my frustration with the results of conventional entrepreneurship. It kills me that founders waste years on bad ideas. Across the globe, there are entrepreneurs, founders, special people trying to create tech startups that will change the world for the better. To give you a sense of what I'm talking about, every year there are over 1 million startups created, and about 7,000 startups get seed funding. Many of those million founders would love to be in that elite group that gets seed funding. This is the focus of most of the entrepreneurial community. This race to the top to get customers and funding and hopefully create $1 billion business, a unicorn. All of that is great. Yet what's overlooked is that of those million startups, and even most of those seed stage startups, most of them fail, as detailed in the show notes. Mitigating those failures, that's my focus. Last year in 2025, about 200 founders attended my workshops. Many of those founders were hoping to create unicorns, and I love that ambition. To do that, founders will often seek support from what are called entrepreneurial support organizations. This could entail anything from the flagship Y Combinator to university programs to local incubators and economic development programs. I've spoken with the leaders from some of these organizations to understand how they engage with founders. And what stood out to me was how much they focus on the winners and they overlook the losers. For instance, I spoke with a leader in Atlanta who told me that every year his program gets 30 startups, of which 10 go on to be viable companies. That's great. But what about the 20 teams that wasted a year on a dead-end idea? I want to know if they could have come to that same conclusion in days instead of that full year. What if they had known sooner that they were pursuing an idea that wasn't going to succeed? As far as I can tell, I'm the only person actively losing sleep over these founders who wasted time chasing a bad idea. In other words, I'm worrying about people like me. The closest thought leaders to me that I've found are Rob Fitzpatrick, who wrote the book The Mom Test, and Alberto Savoia, who wrote the book Prototyping. These books are from years ago, and both authors seem to have moved on from helping startups with no customers. To be clear, I deeply admire these authors, and they made tremendous progress in helping founders avoid wasting time on bad ideas. But there's still a lot more work to be done, and I can't find anybody else doing it. If you know of anyone who's as passionate as I am about mitigating failure, please let me know. I've been looking. You can email me at podcast@nascentidea.com. Overall, most startup supporters that I've spoken with shrug off founders pursuing bad ideas. They'll argue with me that the project wasn't a waste because, the founders learned something. Yeah, but at what cost? It doesn't necessarily have to take a year to figure this out. I bet we can figure out whether or not a startup idea is worth pursuing in days, not years. So you're probably asking, okay, Mike, what's your solution? How do you avoid wasting time on bad ideas? Is there a tool you could use? The closest thing that I've seen to a tool comes from a talk that Paul Graham gave at Stanford. And if you're not sure who Paul Graham is, he created Y Combinator, and he has a very stellar track record of identifying startups that are really compelling and that go on to be wildly successful.
So, how do you know if you're working on real stuff? Well, I know how I know real problems are interesting. So I seem to have some sort of internal compass that helps me out. So what about the rest of us without Paul Graham's internal compass, who don't have that tool? In that Stanford lecture, one of the students in the audience pushed Paul Graham to address this gap. The student said, "What are some good strategies to figure out what matters?"
You mentioned that it's good advice to learn a lot about something that matters.
Yeah.
What are some good strategies to figure out what matters?
You have correctly identified the thing where I didn't really answer the question, where I gave this question-begging answer. I said I'm interested in interesting things. If you're interested in interesting things, work on them and things will all work out, right? But how do you tell what is a real problem? I don't know. That's important enough to write a whole essay about, and I don't know the answer. I probably should write something about that, but I don't know.
I love this clip. Paul Graham is shouting out loud how frustrated he feels that he doesn't know how he's able to identify compelling problems that are actually opportunities worth solving. Well, let me tell you, as much as PG might feel frustrated, the rest of us feel even more frustrated because we desperately want his internal compass. We want to work on compelling problems and avoid distractions. And that's my goal with Nascent, to provide you with a version of Paul Graham's internal compass for startup ideas. But instead of a compass that distinguishes north from south, Nascent categorizes the chance of success for a startup idea as either doubtful or possible. In the simplest sense, Nascent methodology delivers this doubtful versus possible assessment using an input and an output. The input is a batch of recorded discovery interviews, and the output is what I call the ERNY value, where ERNY is spelled ERNY, and it stands for Estimated Revenue Next Year, in dollars from the ground up with no customers today, only based on conversations. Yeah, I know that's a mouthful, which is why I've shortened it down to the acronym ERNY, since we'll be saying it a bunch. But the big idea here that I really want to hit is that estimated revenue next year in dollars using first-hand data is a metric that we can use to distinguish between startup ideas where success is possible from startup ideas where success is doubtful. To be clear, ERNY is not a version of TAM, SAM, SUM, the total addressable market, etc. I don't think using estimates of TAM, SAM, SUM is a useful way of gauging whether there's an opportunity for your specific startup idea. For instance, if I tell you that the total addressable market for US healthcare, it's a $5 trillion industry, how does that help you decide whether or not you should pursue your specific startup idea? I don't think it's very helpful. By contrast, Ernie is only based on the data that you, the founder, collect firsthand from people who are giving you feedback on your specific startup idea. We'll get into the mechanics of this in the coming episodes. But what matters is that if you can get this value, the estimated revenue next year, you can use that as an interpretable signal very similar to Paul Graham's internal compass. If you have an Ernie value that says your revenue next year could be $1 million, that could be an opportunity worth pursuing. And if your Ernie value is just 9 cents, the idea is probably a distraction. The chances of success are probably doubtful. What matters is that this simple metric drives decisiveness so that founders can avoid wasting years on ideas that are not promising. Again, the process of going from discovery interviews to the Ernie value is something that we're going to be covering in depth over the coming episodes of this podcast. So how is this podcast going to work? Why am I relaunching the podcast now? What's my plan? Well, over the past couple years, in 2024 and 2025, I published this podcast about 18 times. It's now March 2026, and I'm relaunching the podcast with the goal of publishing much more regularly. Specifically, my goal is to publish 100 episodes, and I'm aiming to publish 2 episodes a week for the next 50 weeks. Let me be clear, I am not publishing because Nascent is solved. It is not 100% done. Actually, I don't think any methodology is ever 100% done. I'm publishing because I think I've made some progress that's worth sharing. I expect to have iterative improvements as I work with founders to apply this methodology. I know you guys are going to give me feedback and ask really interesting questions and help me refine these ideas. So whatever I'm saying today, know that it's going to get refined even more over time. To date, I have a handful of case studies, and I'm actively looking for more founders to implement Nascent on their startup ideas. Ultimately, everything I'm building with Nascent comes back to one crucial part of our reality today. Today, most founders waste a year or more pursuing bad ideas. It's my goal with Nascent to shrink that timeline from years down to days. So if you've got an idea for a startup, but you're worried whether or not it could be a distraction, then this podcast is going to interest you. I think there is a way to reduce the time that you invest in bad ideas. And I think the way to get there is through a clear, compelling metric like Ernie value, estimated revenue next year, because it's going to drive clarity about whether the startup's chances of success are doubtful or possible. So for those of us who've worked on bad ideas, I want to hear about your experience. I'll go first. One of my more recent startups was called Crayon. I spent 2 years working super hard on Crayon before I decided that it was not an opportunity worth pursuing. I want to hear about your projects. Tell me the name of your project and how long you invested before you realized it wasn't going to work. You can provide me with your feedback in the comments for this episode, or you're welcome to email me, podcast@nascentidea.com, or hit me up on Twitter @nascentidea. And if you ever want to chat one-on-one, let me know. I'm happy to have a short chat. I can send you a link to my scheduler. I genuinely want to engage with anybody who's also obsessed with this problem of avoiding bad ideas. So if this podcast landed for you and you're excited to learn more about Nascent methodology, please subscribe to this podcast because I'm going to be doing a lot more publishing and I don't want you to miss any of these episodes. And as founders, we're a community. There's a really good chance that you know other struggling founders. So I'd love if you'd please share this episode with them so they can also get this alternative playbook, something different from the conventional approach to entrepreneurship. And of course, a review or a rating would really make a big difference, especially during this relaunch. I really appreciate you guys being here, and I'm really excited to get going. And with that, let's find some opportunities worth pursuing. Okay, founders, you got this.